Let me tell you about Zephyr Station. Because if you're going to understand how one human with a hangover and a bad attitude managed to rewrite galactic anthropology textbooks, you need to know where it all went down. Picture the armpit of the galaxy. No, scratch that. Picture the armpit of the galaxy. Then add neon lights, questionable hygiene standards, and the kind of clientele that makes you check your wallet every 30 seconds. That's Zephyr Station for you. It's a spinning metal donut floating in the void, serving as a refueling stop for cargo haulers, smugglers, and the occasional tourist who took a very wrong turn somewhere around the Centauri system. The crown jewel of this fine establishment was Murphy's Law, a bar that had earned its reputation as the place where good judgment went to die. The name wasn't intentional irony, by the way. It was named after the previous owner, a human who'd apparently thought opening a bar in the roughest part of known space was a sound business decision. He'd lasted exactly 3 weeks before selling to the current proprietor, a blob-like creature called Gloop, who communicated entirely through burps and had the business sense of a particularly entrepreneurial mushroom. Now the regulars at Murphy's Law were what you might charitably call a diverse bunch. There was Krex, the bouncer, who stood 8 feet tall and had 4 arms that could crush a steel beam without breaking a sweat. He was a Zelnorian, which meant he looked like someone had crossed a gorilla with a very angry tree, then given the result anger management issues, and a tendency to settle disputes by throwing people through walls. Then you had Captain Voss, an Altarian naval officer, who wore his uniform like it was personally blessed by whatever gods the Altarians worshipped that week. Altarians looked like what would happen if you stretched a human out like taffy, gave them skin the color of expensive copper, and installed a superiority complex where their personality should be. Voss had the additional charm of believing that his military rank gave him the right to lecture everyone within earshot about proper civilization and the natural order of species. And finally there was Pip. Now Pip was a squeaker, which meant he was about the size of a house cat, covered in what looked like purple fur, but was actually some kind of biometal, and had a voice that could shatter glass at 50 paces. What Pip lacked in size, he made up for in pure concentrated nastiness. He was a merchant, which in squeaker culture apparently meant professional con artist with a business license. These three, along with a rotating cast of other questionable characters, had turned Murphy's Law into their personal kingdom. And like all kingdoms, it had a very clear social hierarchy. At the top were the apex species like the Altarians and Zelnorians. In the middle were the useful species like the squeakers and the various other merchants and traders. And at the very bottom, treated like amusing pets at best, and annoying vermin at worst, were humans. See, the thing about humans in galactic society is that we'd only been part of the interstellar community for about 50 years. We were the new kids on the block, and like all new kids, we got picked on. The general consensus among the galaxy's more established species was that humans were weak, primitive, and only good for manual labor and entertainment. We were the cosmic equivalent of those little dogs that rich people carry around in purses, cute and harmless and not worth taking seriously. This attitude was about to get a serious adjustment, courtesy of one Jake Murphy, cargo hauler extraordinaire and the kind of man who could find trouble in an empty room with the lights on. Jake Murphy walked into Murphy's Law looking like he'd been chewed up by a hyperspace jump and spat out somewhere unpleasant. His cargo run from the outer rim had taken 3 weeks longer than scheduled thanks to a customs inspection that was less inspection and more systematic harassment, and he was running on about 4 hours of sleep and pure caffeine. He was your average human, which in galactic terms meant disappointingly small, laughably fragile, and inexplicably still breathing despite all evidence suggesting he shouldn't be. Jake stood maybe 5'10", had the kind of stubble that suggested he'd lost a fight with his razor, and wore a jumpsuit that had seen better decades. To the casual observer, he looked like exactly the kind of harmless primitive that made the galaxy's established species feel so superior. Jake slumped onto a bar stool and held up one finger to Gloop. The usual, he said, which in Jake's case meant whatever alcohol could be served without requiring a hazmat suit. That's when Captain Voss decided to open his mouth. Well, the Altarian said, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that seemed to be standard issue in his species. If it isn't our resident human, still playing cargo hauler, I see. Jake ignored him, which was his usual strategy. Engaging with Voss was like trying to argue with a particularly arrogant lamppost, except lampposts didn't usually have opinions about species hierarchy. But Voss wasn't done. You know, Murphy, I was just explaining to my colleagues here about human resilience, or rather, the complete lack thereof. He gestured grandly to the other patrons, who had started to gather around like sharks smelling blood in the water. It's fascinating, really. How did your species survive long enough to develop space travel? Natural selection should have weeded you out millennia ago. Krex rumbled with laughter, a sound like rocks falling down a mountain, Humans are like those little pets the Valaxians keep. Cute, but you wouldn't want to rely on them for anything important. Pip's voice cut through the noise like a rusty knife. At least the Valaxian pets are useful. They fetch things. What do humans fetch? Trouble, mostly. The laughter that followed was the kind that made Jake's jaw clench. He'd heard it all before, of course. The jokes about human fragility, the casual dismissal of his entire species as cosmic comic relief. Usually he could let it slide. Usually he was too tired or too focused on his next job to care what a bunch of alien bigots thought about him. But today wasn't usually. I heard, Voss continued, warming to his theme, that humans actually cry when they're upset. Leak salt water from their optical organs. Can you imagine? What kind of evolutionary disaster produces a species that literally springs leaks under stress? More laughter. Jake's hand tightened around his drink. And the mating rituals, Pip chimed in. They have to court for months sometimes. Months. Among civilized species, you simply calculate genetic compatibility and file the appropriate paperwork. But humans insist on this primitive emotional bonding nonsense. Jake took a long sip of his drink and set it down very carefully. You done? Voss blinked, apparently surprised that the human was speaking. I'm sorry, what was that? I asked if you were done, Jake said, his voice perfectly level. Because I'm trying to drink in peace, and your mouth is making it difficult to concentrate. The bar went quiet. Even Gloop stopped burping. Voss straightened up to his full 7-foot height, which was apparently his species' way of saying, I'm about to put you in your place, you insignificant little creature. His copper-colored skin actually seemed to gleam in the bar's flickering lights, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that suggested he was about to enjoy himself immensely. Oh, how precious, Voss said, his voice dripping with mock concern. The little human is getting agitated. Should we be worried it might leak on us? That did it. Jake stood up from his bar stool with the kind of calm that should have been a warning sign to anyone with half a brain. Unfortunately, superiority complexes tend to interfere with basic pattern recognition. You know what, Captain? Jake said conversationally. I've had a really long day. 3 weeks of hyperspace jumps, customs officials treating me like I'm smuggling nuclear waste when I'm hauling legitimate cargo. And now I come here for one drink and have to listen to you run your mouth about things you clearly don't understand. Voss laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of arrogance. And what exactly don't I understand, human? Jake rolled his shoulders, a gesture that looked casual but was actually him loosening up muscles that had been cramped in a pilot's seat for way too long. You don't understand that the reason humans cry isn't because we're weak. It's because we're still functional when we're experiencing emotions that would shut down most other species' higher brain functions. He took a step closer to Voss, and something in his posture must have finally registered, because the Altarian's smile flickered just a little. You don't understand that our mating rituals involve months of courtship because we're wired to form permanent pair bonds that make us more effective as a team than any calculating genetic compatibility ever could. Another step closer. The other patrons were starting to back away, which showed they had better survival instincts than their self-appointed spokesperson. And you really don't understand, Jake continued, his voice getting quieter and more dangerous, that everything you think makes us weak is actually what makes us the most persistent, stubborn and creatively violent species this galaxy has ever seen. Voss opened his mouth to deliver what was probably going to be another devastating putdown, and Jake's fist connected with his jaw with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting a bell. Now here's the thing about Altarians. They're tall, they're strong, and they're used to being the apex predators in any given situation. What they're not used to is being punched in the face by something they consider barely above a houseplant on the intelligence scale. Voss went down like a sack of expensive copper-colored potatoes, his eyes wide with the kind of shock usually reserved for people who've just discovered that gravity works differently than they thought. The bar erupted. Krex roared something in Zelnorian that probably translated to "Oh, it is on now," and came charging across the room with all 4 arms extended. Now Krex had about 3 feet and 200 pounds on Jake, plus those extra arms and what looked like natural armor plating. In any reasonable universe, this should have been the part where Jake got turned into human paste. Instead, Jake did something that apparently wasn't in the Zelnorian combat manual. He grabbed a bar stool and threw it. Not at Krex's head, where the big alien was expecting it. Not at his center mass, where his natural armor was thickest. Jake threw it at Krex's legs, specifically at the knee joint that had to support all that bulk. Krex went down hard, and while he was trying to figure out how a piece of furniture had just outsmarted him, Jake kicked him in what he hoped was a sensitive area. The sound Krex made suggested Jake had guessed correctly. Pip, meanwhile, had apparently decided that size was no barrier to righteous indignation and launched himself at Jake's head, claws extended and making a noise like a smoke detector having a nervous breakdown. Jake caught him mid-leap, and for a moment they stared at each other, the tiny alien suspended in Jake's grip like an angry purple football. "Nothing personal," Jake said, and threw Pip across the room into a group of Centaurian traders who had been watching the show with the detached interest of people who thought they were safely out of range. They were wrong. The Centaurians, now covered in furious squeaker, did what any reasonable species would do and started trying to get Pip off them before he could do any permanent damage to their credit ratings. This involved a lot of flailing, which knocked over their table, which crashed into the next table, which started a chain reaction that somehow managed to involve every patron in the bar who wasn't already unconscious. Jake stood in the middle of the chaos, breathing hard but not even winded, and realized that the fight was just getting started. Because while Voss was down and Krex was reconsidering his life choices, there were still about a dozen other aliens who had apparently decided that the honor of their respective species was at stake. This was going to be fun. What happened next was the kind of beautiful, terrible chaos that combat instructors across the galaxy would later study and shake their heads at in professional bewilderment. See, the thing about bar fights is that most species approach them with a certain dignity. Zelnorians lumber forward and try to crush you with overwhelming force. Altarians use their reach and try to maintain tactical superiority. Squeakers go for the eyes and rely on speed and viciousness. It's all very civilized and predictable. Humans, on the other hand, fight like the universe personally insulted their mothers. Jake grabbed a half-empty bottle of vegan whiskey off the bar and smashed it against the edge, creating what bartenders everywhere recognize as the universal sign that someone's about to have a very bad day. A Rigelian merchant who'd been trying to flank him suddenly found himself staring at 10 inches of jagged glass held by someone who looked like he'd used improvised weapons before. "You want some of this?" Jake asked pleasantly. The Rigelian, who looked like a cross between a lizard and an accountant, decided that discretion was the better part of not getting perforated and backed away so fast he tripped over his own tail. But there were plenty of others ready to take his place. A pair of Denibolan brothers, each about the size of a small spaceship and twice as ugly, came at Jake from opposite sides. Denibolans are what happen when evolution decides that subtlety is overrated and just makes everything bigger, stronger, and more likely to solve problems by hitting them really hard. Jake waited until they were almost on him, then dropped to the floor and swept the legs of the one on his right. As brother number 1 went down in a crash that shook the whole station, Jake rolled under a table and came up behind brother number 2 with a chair in his hands. Now, this wasn't just any chair. This was one of those heavy metal chairs that spacebars use because they're built to survive being thrown by species with 4 times human strength. Jake swung it like he was trying to hit a baseball into orbit, and the sound it made when it connected with the Denibolan's skull was like a gong being struck by a very angry god. Brother number 2 swayed for a moment, looking confused, then toppled backward into the arms of a Calaxian diplomat who definitely hadn't signed up for this when he'd stopped in for a quiet drink. The Calaxian, now pinned under roughly 400 pounds of unconscious Denibolan, started making the kind of noises that suggested his species really wasn't built for this level of excitement. His 3 companions rushed to help him, which meant they weren't paying attention when Jake vaulted over the bar and started treating Gloop's liquor collection like an ammunition depot. Bottles started flying, not randomly, mind you. Jake had apparently done this before, because each bottle found its target with the kind of precision that spoke of either extensive practice or natural talent for mayhem. A Sarian trader took a bottle of fermented Catarian root wine to the forehead and went down like he'd been struck by lightning. 2 Packled merchants got hit simultaneously with matching bottles of synthahol and stood there for a moment, blinking in perfect synchronization, before collapsing in a heap. Krex, meanwhile, had managed to get back on his feet and was looking at Jake with the kind of expression usually reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. The big Zelnorian had dealt with bar fights before, but this was something entirely new. Humans weren't supposed to fight like this. They were supposed to be weak and civilized and easy to intimidate. Instead, this particular human was treating Murphy's Law like his personal playground and everyone in it like training dummies. Krex charged again, this time leading with all 4 arms in a move that should have turned Jake into a very flat human pancake. But Jake had grabbed the bar's cash register, a solid chunk of metal and electronics that probably weighed 40 pounds, and swung it like a weapon that had been specifically designed to rearrange Zelnorian facial features. The impact sent Krex staggering backward, and Jake pressed his advantage. He grabbed the big alien's lower left arm, and used it as leverage to swing himself up and around, ending up on Krex's back like the world's most dangerous monkey. Krex spun around, trying to shake him off, but Jake had wrapped his legs around the alien's thick neck and was using his fists to play a percussion solo on Krex's skull. The spinning got faster and more desperate, until Krex finally lost his balance and crashed into the wall with Jake still attached. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and what sounded suspiciously like Zelnorian profanity. By this point, the other patrons had divided into 3 groups. Group 1 was unconscious. Group 2 was trying to get out of the bar before they joined Group 1. And Group 3 was standing around the edges, placing bets on the outcome with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. 50 credits says the human's down in 30 seconds, someone called out. You're on, came the reply. I've got 100 that says he takes out 3 more before he goes down. Jake, still sitting on Krex's chest and breathing only slightly hard, looked around at the wreckage that had once been Murphy's Law. Broken furniture, unconscious aliens, and enough spilled alcohol to sterilize a small moon. Captain Voss was just starting to come around, holding his jaw and looking at Jake like he was seeing him for the first time. Pip was hanging upside down from a light fixture, apparently having bounced off several surfaces before ending up there, making weak chirping sounds that suggested his vocabulary had temporarily abandoned him. And Jake? Jake cracked his knuckles and grinned. So, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Anyone else want to discuss human evolutionary biology? The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that happens when reality decides to take a sharp left turn and everyone's still trying to figure out which way is up. Jake climbed off Krex's chest and dusted himself off, which was mostly for show since his jumpsuit had been through worse than one little bar fight. He walked over to where Gloop was cowering behind what was left of the bar, pulled out his credit chip and placed it on the scarred surface. Sorry about the mess, Jake said conversationally. Put the damages on my tab and I'll take another drink when you get a chance. Gloop made a sound like a deflating balloon having an existential crisis. His 3 eye stalks swiveled to take in the devastation that had once been his establishment, then focused on Jake with the kind of expression usually reserved for forces of nature or unexpected tax refunds. The betting crowd was having their own crisis. The alien who'd bet 50 credits that Jake would be down in 30 seconds was staring at his chronometer like it had personally betrayed him. The one who'd wagered on Jake taking out 3 more aliens was counting unconscious bodies with the focused intensity of someone trying to figure out if he'd just won the lottery or needed to find a new bookie. 14, he said finally. 14 aliens down and the humans asking for another drink. Captain Voss had managed to sit up against the wall, still holding his jaw. His copper skin had taken on a distinctly greenish tinge, and he was looking at Jake like he was seeing him for the first time. Which in a way he was. You, Voss said, his usual arrogance replaced by something that might have been respect or might have been terror. How did you do that? Jake shrugged and accepted his drink from Gloop, whose tentacles were shaking so badly he could barely hold the bottle. Do what? Have a conversation. You started it, Captain. I just finished it. You fought 14 aliens simultaneously and won, Voss said, apparently still trying to process what he'd witnessed. That's not possible. Humans are weak. Fragile, the science is clear on this. Jake took a sip of his drink and made a face. Whatever Gloop had poured, it tasted like industrial solvent mixed with regret. Your science might want to factor in a few things it's been missing. He walked over to where Pip was still hanging from the light fixture and carefully extracted the little alien, setting him on a table that was only slightly destroyed. Pip looked up at him with the wide-eyed expression of someone who'd just had their entire worldview demolished by a flying bar stool. See, here's the thing about humans, Jake continued, addressing the room like he was giving a lecture instead of standing in the wreckage of the galaxy's most notorious dive bar. We didn't evolve to be the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. We evolved to be the most obnoxiously persistent species the universe has ever produced. He gestured around at the unconscious aliens. Every single one of these species is stronger than us, tougher than us, better designed for combat than us. But they all fight like they've got something to lose. Humans fight like we've got nothing left to lose and we're taking everyone with us. Krex groaned and tried to sit up, which took him 3 attempts and resulted in a sound like a landslide having second thoughts. Impossible, he rumbled. Humans are prey species. Weak, soft, Jake laughed, and it wasn't entirely a pleasant sound. Krex buddy, let me explain something to you about prey species. You know what the most dangerous animal on Earth is? It's not the biggest or the strongest. It's the one that's cornered and has cubs to protect. We're all cubs to each other, and we've been cornered since the day we figured out we weren't alone in the universe. The implications of this statement rippled through the room like a shockwave. The aliens who were still conscious started looking at each other with expressions that ranged from confusion to dawning horror. But the studies, Voss protested weakly. The psychological profiles. Humans show empathy, emotional attachment, irrational behavior patterns. Yeah, Jake said, finishing his drink and setting the glass down with deliberate care. We care about each other even when it's tactically stupid. We form emotional bonds with complete strangers. We'll fight to the death for people we've never met just because they're the same species as us. You know what that makes us? He looked around the room, making eye contact with every conscious alien. Absolutely fucking terrifying. The words hung in the air like a revelation. These aliens had spent decades thinking of humans as harmless pets, useful for manual labor and occasional entertainment. They'd built their entire understanding of human psychology around the idea that emotion was weakness, that empathy was a tactical disadvantage, that forming irrational bonds was a sign of primitive thinking. They'd never considered that a species wired to care about strangers might also be wired to kill for them. The first alien to break the silence was one of the Centaurian traders, who'd been quietly recording the whole thing on his personal communicator. "This is going to be all over the networks by tomorrow," he said, his voice filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences or really good street food. "The Galactic Anthropology Department is going to have a collective aneurysm," another voice added. 50 years of research just went out the airlock. Jake checked his chronometer and sighed. "Well, this has been fun, but I've got a cargo run to finish. Gloop, thanks for the drinks. Next time I'll try to keep the property damage to a minimum." He started walking toward the door, stepping over unconscious aliens and broken furniture with the casual air of someone who'd just finished a particularly satisfying workout. As he reached the exit, he paused and looked back at the room full of aliens who were still trying to process what they'd witnessed. "Oh, and Captain," he said to Voss, "next time you want to discuss human psychology, maybe lead with the part where we're all clinically insane by galactic standards. It'll save everyone some time." The door slid shut behind him, leaving the survivors to contemplate their new understanding of humanity in the wreckage of their old assumptions. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. Because what happened next wasn't just local gossip. It was the kind of cultural earthquake that reshapes entire civilizations. Within 6 hours, that Centaurian trader's recording had been uploaded to the Galactic Information Network. Within 12 hours, it had been viewed by every major news outlet from the core worlds to the outer rim. Within 24 hours, "Human destroys bar full of aliens" was the most watched video in galactic history, beating out the previous record holder, which had been a compilation of Altarian politicians falling down stairs. The title alone broke the network's trending algorithms. Dr. Kellex VRN, the galaxy's leading expert on human psychology and the author of 17 books on the subject, watched the video exactly once before requesting immediate sabbatical and checking himself into a meditation retreat on one of the outer moons of Rigel 7. His assistant found a note on his desk that read simply, "Everything I've written is wrong. Please burn my research. Burn it all." The Galactic Anthropological Institute called an emergency session for the first time in 3 centuries. The emergency was, and I quote from their official statement, "a complete and fundamental reassessment of humanity's threat classification." The meeting lasted for 6 days, and ended with half the board resigning, and the other half requesting hazard pay for continued human interaction. But the real fun started when the video reached the military networks. Admiral Thex of the Altarian Defense Force, who had spent the last decade writing strategic assessments that basically amounted to humans are useful as cannon fodder and not much else, found himself staring at footage of one cargo hauler dismantling an entire bar with the kind of tactical creativity that his best special forces operators would have envied. The Admiral's first response was to declare the video a fake. His second response, after his technical team assured him it was genuine, was to quietly cancel a planned military exercise that would have involved human auxiliary forces in a support role, and to immediately begin drafting new protocols for human integration in combat units. The Zelnorian Combat Academy, which had previously classified humans as non-threatening civilian support personnel, watched Krex get systematically dismantled by someone a third his size and weight, and quietly updated their threat assessment database. Humans were reclassified from minimal concern to approach with extreme caution and preferably from a different star system. The economic implications were equally dramatic. Insurance companies across the galaxy suddenly found themselves reassessing policies involving human employees. Cargo companies that employed human pilots saw their rates increase overnight. The Interstellar Mercenary Guild, which had previously refused human membership applications, sent a formal invitation to Jake Murphy along with a signing bonus that would have bought a small moon. Jake, meanwhile, was completely oblivious to the galactic chaos he'd caused because he was doing what cargo haulers do, hauling cargo. His next delivery run took him to the mining stations in the Kepler system, where he was scheduled to pick up a load of processed titanium and transport it to the shipyards at Wolf 359. What he found when he arrived at the mining station was a reception committee. Station Administrator Volks, a normally aggressive packard who'd built his reputation on squeezing every possible credit out of passing traders, practically genuflected when Jake walked up to the docking manifest desk. The man who had previously treated human cargo haulers like a minor inconvenience was suddenly offering premium docking privileges, complimentary fuel top-offs, and what appeared to be his firstborn child as a gesture of goodwill. "Mr. Murphy," Volks stammered, his usual bluster replaced by the kind of nervous energy usually associated with people who've just realized they've been sharing a room with a live grenade. "Such an honor. Such a tremendous honor. Please let us handle your cargo loading personally. No charge. Our pleasure entirely." Jake stared at him. "Volks, are you feeling all right? Last time I was here, you charged me extra for breathing your recycled air." "That was before," Volks said quickly. "Before we understood, before we knew what humans were truly capable of." It was then that Jake noticed the other changes. The station security guards, normally a surly bunch of various species who treated human visitors like potential shoplifters, were keeping a respectful distance and nodding politely when he made eye contact. The dock workers were handling his cargo containers with the kind of care usually reserved for unstable explosives. And everyone, absolutely everyone, was staring at him with expressions that ranged from nervous respect to outright fear. "What exactly happened while I was in hyperspace?" Jake asked. Volks pulled up a holographic display and showed him the video. Jake watched himself demolish Murphy's Law with the kind of detached interest of someone watching a stranger's home movies. When it was over, he shrugged. "Huh," he said. "Decent camera work. Though I think the angle makes my ass look fat." The station administrator made a sound like a small animal choking on its own terror. Jake collected his cargo manifest and headed back to his ship, leaving behind a mining station full of aliens who were busily recalculating everything they thought they knew about human psychology, human capabilities, and human threat assessment. As his ship cleared the station's docking bay and jumped to hyperspace, Jake settled back in his pilot's chair and cracked open a beer. He had no idea that academic institutions across the galaxy were rewriting their textbooks, that military strategists were having nervous breakdowns, or that insurance actuaries were developing new mathematics to calculate the probability of human-related incidents. All he knew was that the next time he walked into a bar, he probably wouldn't have to listen to a bunch of aliens lecture him about human inferiority. And honestly, that was worth a little property damage. The galaxy had learned something important that day. Humans weren't the weak, primitive species they'd been categorized as. They were something far more dangerous, an entire civilization of individuals who were all slightly unhinged, completely unpredictable, and absolutely willing to fight anyone about anything if you pushed them far enough. The funny thing was, Jake would later reflect, this wasn't even him having a particularly good day. This was just Tuesday.